Feminist women.
Mulheres feministas.
زنان فمینیست.
Vanyu vachikonzero chevakazi.
نساء.
Mujeres feministas.
Yam femini. Femactivism.
Nari mukti.
Matapang na babae. Kechimai ka ishk.
Welcome to KPFA Radio's Women's Magazine. I'm Lisa Detmer, and I'm your host today. And today we have two segments, both focusing on Buddhism, healing, and spirituality. In the second half of the show, we will talk to Dr. Rima Vesely Vlad about her new book, The Fire Inside the Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. But first we talked to Kirthi Nath and Lata about two new films showing at the Elmwood Rialto Cinema on Wednesday, August 19th at 6:15 as part of a special one-time program called Cinema as Prayer, a night of queer South Asian films. This film program features Paramita by Kirthi Nath and Longing Sweet by Lata and Nicolás Grandi, two poetic films that move through longing, belonging, and spiritual transformation. Paramita bears witness to Prajna Choudhury's 25-year journey of coming out to her traditional Bangladeshi mother. Told with intimacy and tenderness, the film invites us into a meditative experience as Prajna connects with Buddhist practice and nature as gateways for intergenerational healing. Longing Sweet is a lyrical exploration of awakening to the divine feminine. Building on a cycle of poems written by Mani in the 1990s, the film traces the arc of a heart, mind, body awakening to the sacred in all that exists. Together, these intimate spiritual films invite us to experience cinema as prayer. Let's hear a short cut of the trailers from both films before we go to that interview.
I came out to myself when I was about 18 years old, when I was in college. In 1995, when I was 21, I attended a conference by Tricone for queer South Asians. I told my mom I was attending a conference for South Asian women, and she said, "Why did you go to this conference?" And in this whole conversation, neither of us once used the words gay or lesbian, but we knew what we were talking about.
I am remembering who I am. I am remembering who I am. I am remembering. I am remembering. I am remembering who I am.
I cannot say that she called, and I took to my heels and fled.
Ya Devi
You who gave birth to this longing, won't you feed, clothe, and rear it?
I thank you for the I amness, for the I that I am, and the I that feeds and sustains me.
May longing blow its cooling breezes and warming winds across this body. No more the cry of a drowning lover. All of life seems like prayer in motion.
Welcome, Lata and Kirthi, to KPFA Radio's Women's Magazine. I'm so glad to have the two of you. I just rewatched both of your films. They're really so many connections between these two films. Both are seeking or showing spiritual support and connection and healing, and also a maternal love or divine feminine. Both mention or play the song Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child, and both find it, and both, or hopefully, and for both, the earth is important for that healing and remembering and connection. So there's just so many similarities, and they're both very lyrical. Kirthi, why don't I start with you? What led you to make this film, and what spiritual practices were you bringing to this film?
It's an interesting question to reflect on what inspired me to make the film, because now 7 years later, the shape and layers and meaning has just changed so much. I would think actually like deepened and expanded. So back in 2019, I'd been building my business, my film business, for about 10 years, and had taken a break from doing personal films. And someone encouraged me to apply for Represent Media's Retake Oakland. And it was this really amazing BIPOC filmmaker incubator where we had mentors, and we were invited to make a personal narrative film centering a person of color from Oakland. And it was a really beautiful invitation for me to kind of come back to my own personal filmmaking after doing a lot of movement film, social justice films, which are always my filmmaking style, but it's something different. And I remember thinking like, wow, I would love to have a story about a woman of color, something about spirituality, maybe Buddhism. And wouldn't it even be that much more amazing if I found a South Asian queer lesbian woman who is a Buddhist? As someone who also has had that experience, it has been at that time, it was just really sad and heartbreaking to be part of Western Buddhism and to feel such erasure as a South Asian woman and a woman of color. And it was actually my beloved who said, what about Proga? And I knew Proga. She was my acupuncturist for a time, and then I had done meditation with her, and we were in community. And so I asked her if I could make a film about her. And just like backing up a little, she's also a lesbian, and I had heard that her entire South Asian family came to her wedding. And I was just intrigued. I was like, wow, like I'd never heard of something like that. And I wanted to hear more. And as someone who was not quite at that stage of successfully at the time being out to my mom or being at the wedding, I had met the beloved. I had that longing, and I was like, I want to hear that story. And then when she told me the story, I had invited her for tea, and I think she knew me, so she trusted me, and she thought, okay, Kirthi's going to tell my story with tenderness. So we were having tea, and I was listening to her stories. And when I heard about the process, the 25-year journey, I knew that I needed to tell this story. And I knew it wasn't just a simple story of acceptance or rejection or a moment. It was like a journey and a process. And to also hear about the ways she connected with nature and Buddhist practices as part of her journey, it became really clear to me that like this film was going to be a transmission. And the film itself took about 4 years to make. And through that time, and we can talk about this more later, you know, there was a lot of like embodied practices of like being in nature, tuning into like what part of the story does the hills or the water or the trees want to tell. And also like, you know, being in spaces that were really important to either me or Proga, and, you know, being with the vibration and the transmission.
Yeah, and I just really love the paramita means journey to wisdom or to coming to the other side.
Well, I mean, Paramis is a Hindu and Buddhist name. So Paramis, it's a loosely translated from Buddhism and Pali. We call it perfectional wisdoms. Yeah. And it's kind of like the practices that lead to, I think, the moments of liberation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I also felt like it was a feminist story. The mom comes to support her daughter's lesbianism as the mother becomes more self-confident in her own life and is inspired by her daughter's own bravery. And I just found that was so moving and really explains to me how misogyny is really so underlying homophobia. I really appreciated that story.
I was having initial interviews with Proga in my living room and just recording on an audio mic. We weren't even like filming. And then this is even before I was even recording. I remember she talked about allowing her mom to have her own process.
Yeah.
And that really landed with me deeply. And I think allowing her mom to have her own process and allowing herself to have her own process is what helped them stay in connection and be part of repair also. And, when I actually came out to my mom and then I told her I was getting married, it really was a guide for me to let my mom have her own process, because she was just like, it was challenging for her. And now fast forward, she's best friends with my beloved and like adores my daughter. But just like the passing on of like that lived experience was like so meaningful. And as I share like the film with other people, whether they've had stories that are similar in terms of like all the demographics or not, like I think like people really are appreciating this idea of like time as being part of the process and part of the healing. And also how important it is for us to not only have stories that are like rooted in suffering and healing, especially as women of color, queer people, where we are also the healers. And like, we are also part of like the transformation and the medicine.
Right. And Lata, your film was also very beautiful, longing, sweet. It's also very lyrical, and also talks about the divine feminine. What is the longing in this film for?
It is a longing for what is already true, but we do not experience, which is our always already interconnectedness with each other and with the whole of the universe. Something in the birth canal cuts off that, along with the umbilical cord, that connection to our primordial union with all things. Whether you think of it in terms of a deity, or you think of it in terms of the huge moment of eruption of light from the black hole. However you think of the origin of life, life is always already interconnected, but as we know, we experience it as so many dislocations, as so many estrangements, and as so many antagonisms. So that when we arrive at some kind of decision to be part of a spiritual practice or to take up a spiritual practice or a journey, we are gradually introduced through those practices to glimpses of what is always already true, but we do not experience. So that is the longing, that is the arc of the 11 poems that compose Longing Sweet, where the seeker in the film begins with the arrival of the feminine divine in the seeker's life. And then that love transforms the seeker's body, the seeker's consciousness, activates that deep sense of separation, and then gradually, through the practices, through the longing, that longing is healed as you begin to feel that interconnectedness with the sky, the worms, the trees, all of nature, the frogs. And part of discovering that is also dismantling the division of this kind of cosmic truth into so many religions, which are then divided against each other and become part of the fabric of division that we need to unlearn through our various journeys and practices. So there is music from Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, interwoven into the soundtrack, so that the sonic narrative, it's not interfaith, it is the actual interweaving of the wisdoms and their essential truths with one another.
Hmm. I really love the way you slow down time in the film, which I think is something I learned in Buddhism. And I think you've already talked about the spiritual practices that you brought to this film. So can you talk about the slowing down of time and how that helps people to be able to access this connection?
Absolutely. We have developed our formal practice, our aesthetic practices from our contemplative practices. And if you think about meditation, one of the things you learn is to not overly identify with the flow of thoughts or the flow of feelings, whether they are peaceful or whether they're unpeaceful, but you learn how to become a witness. So in our films, we try to position the viewer as alternately a witness, an observer, and an experiencer, just as we have in meditation, right? And when we sit to meditate, we begin to understand that that which we had thought of as a synthesizing capacity to grasp the whole, we actually realize we're grasping it in fragments. So part of what we are doing here, it's not a fragment that divides, but it is a fragment to which you have to call to pay attention. After all, we have so many thoughts in meditation, but we choose where to focus. So you will see that in the film, we've built in multiple frames. And the idea is that, again, the viewer can draw on their own agency to choose where to focus in the screen. And part of what enables you to do that without fragmenting and dividing is by taking your time, trusting that time is what holds people in subjection. Quick, fast, linear, moving in a certain direction. Whereas it is precisely that kind of story that comes to crisis when you actually sit to meditate. You realize there are multiple timelines. There's a timeline in the body, there's a timeline in the heart, there's a timeline in the mind, and they're not all converging. And yet, something holds it together. So that even if it's a difficult meditation, you have experienced some measure of release or relief. So how do we work with the fragment as a fractal in the context of developing an aesthetic that can both give people the experience of the particular, but also within a unifying field of audio, visuality, and sound that holds and enables.
So you've talked about how your three different spiritual practices, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Catholicism or Christianity. And the divine feminine, does it cross all three? And do you actually, when you are experiencing this spirituality, do you believe, do you feel it? Because I have yet to find transcendence, so I'm always wanting to know what it feels like from those who have actually experienced it, if you have.
Well, one of the hopes of the film is to allow people to experience the beautifully intimate dance between immanence and transcendence. In so many of the traditions, what is really privileged is transcendence. And those of us who are interested in the human experience as in and of itself of value, significance, and meaning, such as in our social justice circles, for example, are very interested in what is actually happening in matter and how matter matters. So the tantric seam in all traditions, in all the mystical traditions, actually undoes that opposition between immanence and transcendence. So you notice that we spend a lot of time on detail in the film. The little worm, the butterfly, the frog. And we hope that by drawing our attention to that, we can experience something that is that, but also more than that. And the more than that does not erase the that, right? And that is the coming together of immanence and transcendence. Now, the divine feminine is available in all her raw power in Hinduism and in Tibetan Buddhism, for example. And she is also there as the Virgin of Guadalupe, the Black Madonna, Mother Mary, you know, this powerful, after all, we say the mother of all wars, the mother of all bombs. So regardless of the fact that religion has become patriarchal, the raw power to create that is associated with the feminine is very present in these in all traditions, actually, and has been brought to light by so many feminist scholars and feminist and women mystics.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate you for bringing that up. I found both of your films very healing and inspiring, and I really appreciated both of them, and I think they're beautiful films that go together beautifully. What do you hope people are getting from this film? Like, what is it that you're hoping people get from this?
You know, you're asking about like the, you know, healing and the transmission. And as I was with Praga's story and also listening for how to tell it, this was the early part of the pandemic where I was taking a lot of walks. And people who are from the Bay Area might recognize a lot of like the landscapes. I remember walking in Alameda Beach and being so present and realizing that at low tide, you can walk like a mile into the ocean and you can be in the ocean and become the ocean. And, you know, those are really powerful moments where like I was feeling something very mystical and magical. And then my filmmaker voice would be like, I wonder if Proga would stand in the ocean, because I think this could be part of that part of the story. Or when I was walking in Tilden and I would be with the groves, like the grove of trees would ask me to like, come inside, come dance within me. And again, like there are literally scenes where like Proga is like dancing in nature. And it also reminds me, as we're talking, that like, you know, I've had very powerful experiences of something, you know, that feels very divine when I've been in nature, and that separation dissolves because the connection with nature is also very present in Praga's life. It was a beautiful relationship and a dance between us also to be in relationship and communication as we were like telling the story. But also the film took 4 years. And I think that allowed us to also build our relationship, and time is part of our relationship. And then her mom also, who was a very private, personal person, you know, started to be like, oh, what's going on with that film? And in the time, like, you know, she retired, wrote a book of poetry, and I had a baby during the film. And so by the time, you know, we had done the first half, and by the time it came to the second half, there had been so much that had opened up. There was a line that's now in the film, that the mom wrote this piece of poetry that happened like, you know, 4 years later when I was wrapping up the film. And I thought, oh, this is the landing. And there are parts of each other's story that they felt more safe, and they knew I could hold it with the sacredness that, you know, the parts about hearing about the mom's transformation, they were more willing and wanting to say like, here, bring this into the fabric and the sacredness, because this is also part of our healing. So I think like it was a really beautiful experience to really have so many layers of relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I found the story of the mother basically finding herself and, you know, ultimately finding her independence and her courage and authentic self was also the paralleling of the character in the film. And I felt like it was as an older person, I found it extremely heartening. So I really appreciate that story.
As I've started to share the film in community, and I've also paired the film with a healing workshop, Opening Doorways for Belonging and Liberation, where I pair the film with meditation and sacred journaling and small groups and community harvest and ritual. It's been a really powerful experience to see how the film now is like making meaning, and for people to share about their own like exploration and understanding of healing, of like, when I heal myself, I'm healing generations backwards and forwards, whether they're within our own blood lineage or not. I think it opens up that like my healing is not selfish. Mm-hmm. It's part of the medicine and fabric for the world. And also for people who have been South Asian and queer, I've gotten the feedback of like, it was so powerful to have like a mirror where I can hold these parts of myself. They don't have to be fragmented. And then there's just been people who have had like various ruptures with like their family or loved ones, and whether they've been able to have like repair in their own life, but to somehow like be part of the vibration of repair has been very healing for them. So it's been like such a journey to like feel the shape that this film continues to ripple, and like I'm really thankful to be part of this gift.
And Lata, you've made a series, you've made another film and an installation and a book, right?
We made several. Nicolás and I have made about 7 films. And the last one, I believe you were at the opening
Yes.
of the Poetics of Fragility. And in all of we are both meditators, and in all of our films, what we were trying to do was to, in the previous film, take an idea and offer an experience of it. So not just talk about fragility, but offer an experience of a sensorial experience, because I began as a writer and the word still feels to me like my primary language. But thanks to Nicolás's sort of outrageous invitation to work with him, I've had a chance to experience the delight that working with image and sound can bring, and especially together. And in Longing Suite, what we're hoping to offer the viewer is an experience of an experience, as opposed to an experience of an idea. So longing is something we hope you will experience, whether or not you have any interest in the sacred. We hope that you can experience it physically, physiologically, and that it can stimulate some questions for you in an open-ended way, which is what poetry gives us. So, in a time when it feels as though we are very anxious about what word we're using to describe what reality, and we're trying to ensure that only a particular interpretation lands well, we'd like to open up the experience and allow people to explore if they wish or not, if they don't.
Right, and you had your own journey, Lata. You used to be very secular, and you
That's
had a
right.
distrust of religion, and you said you were pulled in through energy rather than through discourse. Can you talk about that a little bit, your own journey on that?
Absolutely. You would know as a meditator that as soon as you sit to meditate, the first thing that comes to crisis is various ideas you've had, whether it's about yourself or the world, right? In my case, I never sat to meditate. I had no interest, but I had a brain injury. And the brain injury made thinking impossible. So for many years, I was in bed in enormous amounts of pain, but I began to experience this energy that would come every afternoon and keep me company. And it filled me with love, and it filled me with an expansiveness that I had no language for. And it was deeply humbling. And I felt that all I could do was to sit at its feet or lie at its feet and allow it to teach me. And thus began a very, very long journey. Eventually, I, like everyone else, had to learn how to sit cross-legged and meditate. But the invitation came to me wordlessly. So when in all of our work, we're trying to see, is it possible to evoke, invoke, and share something of the wordless that people can carry with them when they leave the theater?
Mm-hmm. Well, both of your films are beautiful, lyrical, and the spiritual energy from both of you shines through in your film. So I hope people can come to the showing on August 19th at 6:15 at the Elmwood Theater. It's called Cinema as Prayer, a night of queer South Asian films. And please go to Rialto Cinemas Elmwood in Berkeley's website to get tickets. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining me today, and I will see you at the films.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
That was an interview with directors Lata and Kirthi Nath about their film showing at a special one-night film program called Cinema as Prayer, a night of queer South Asian films. The screening will be followed by a conversation and Q&A with the filmmakers, moderated by Madeline Lim, Executive and Artistic Director of QUACMAC, Queer Women of Color Media Arts Project. Go to the Elmwood Rialto Theater's website for tickets, which will probably sell out, so go soon. And now I talk with Vesely Flad, the author of The Fire Inside, The Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde, a book exploring the radical literary legacies of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde through a dharmic lens. The Fire Inside reveals how the two of America's greatest literary voices reflect and expand Buddhism's most timeless truth toward justice and liberation, showing that liberation depends not only on organizing mass movements, but on the generative power of inner well-being, authenticity, art, and embodiment. It offers space for the kind of conversation our communities need, one that centers and celebrates Black, queer, radical thought and doesn't shy away from difficult truths. Welcome to KPFA Radio's Women's Magazine, Rima Vesely Flad. I've wanted to have you on since I heard you really interesting talk about your new book, The Fire Inside, The Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde at the East Bay Meditation Center this past June. And since then, I've read your book, and I have an even deeper appreciation of what you're saying about Baldwin and Lorde's perspectives on suffering and self-awareness, healing, and healing from suffering. Your book really helped me to move beyond my own superficial knowledge of Lorde's concepts from the slogans that we used in ACT UP, which is silence equals death, and also to better understand what she means by the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, to a deeper understanding of her own dealing with suffering and death and transformation. And your book also helped me to better understand Baldwin, who had to deal with so much racism and homophobia, including internalized self-hatred, which he got from his father's abuse, but he found a way to hold the suffering through self-awareness and speaking in his writings. You talk about how you also grew up around a lot of racism from your family. Can you tell us how these writers have helped you to find healing?
Yes, thank you, Lisa, for this invitation and for your deep engagement with this work. And I'll just say at the outset, I'm trained as an academic, and the first several versions of this book were all academic versions. And it was only when a teacher in our tradition or lineage, Ruth King, called me out and said, "We need your practice," that I started to think about how I used or employed Baldwin and Lorde and looked to them as teachers, as ancestors who had gone before and worked on all these different dimensions, far beyond the political dimension, to heal themselves and to wrestle with the ways in which hatred came at them and the consequent anger they felt, very justified anger, and to look to how they worked with those feelings and experiences skillfully. And of course, the Buddhist tradition offers many practices for working through what Baldwin and Lorde so ably and so succinctly name in their own lives. So I think sometimes we're called forth to use our lives to illuminate bigger truths, and they certainly did that as forebears, and I attempted to do that in this book, and I'm glad that that approach resonates with you in real time. I do feel that both James Baldwin and Audre Lorde took their suffering, their personal suffering, very seriously. And because they did so, they were able, in a very empathic way, to look to other people's suffering and to honor it and to validate it. And I certainly feel that as a reader, as a younger reader, coming to them and saying, I have these grandparents who wish that I had never been born. I have a father who disappeared when I was 7 years old and didn't come back. What do I do with all of this? And I looked to them as people who named their own suffering. They both named the suffering of being hated within their families and what it meant for their nervous systems, what it meant for their coming of age development. They named their relationships with siblings and how complicated that was for Baldwin. He's very much a caretaker for 7 younger siblings, and he embraced that. But he had a really difficult relationship with his father, who was in actuality his stepfather. And in a certain way, that is a relationship that was so important for him that he names the the depth of growth he did in taking it seriously. But even as he grew, it was deeply painful. For Audre Lorde, who moved in the second generation women's movement, who self-identified as lesbian and honored other women's relationships, sexual, gender relationships in such evocative and complicated ways. I think, here's someone who took the status quo and said, no, thank you. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Let's create alternatives. And part of, I think, why that was so important is that she had really difficult relationships with her sisters and with her mother, but she never rejected relationships with women. And instead she said, let's do this differently. And she did it differently. And she was part of a movement that decided, no, we will not reject each other because we don't conform. Instead, we'll honor each other's differences. Let's embrace, let's make the net wider. Let's make the terrain on which we're moving broader. Let's be inclusive. I think there's something really profound. And in my own healing work, it's not so much that I had to reconcile with my grandparents or other white supremacists in my family, it's that I had to find something else. And so a part of this book is that journey of finding my father's people, finding my other lineages, and really honoring that endurance, that strength, that capacity to move forward.
As you said, both Lorde and Baldwin talk about embracing suffering. Baldwin talks about how to suffer skillfully, you say, and that people who can't suffer can't grow up. And he points to white people and their avoidance of suffering, including death. You also cite Baldwin as saying that since Black people can't avoid the suffering from white supremacy, they have the capacity to see through the delusion and identify the root of their suffering if they embrace their pain. And if they embrace their pain, they will find joy and their relationship to each other. So it's about creating a relationship, while white people are stuck in an infantile relationship to suffering. I really find his analysis so deep, and I read the biography about him recently, and really helped me to better understand what he went through, but also his analysis. But this emphasis on suffering is similar to the Buddhist analysis of suffering, but with an awareness of racism, sexism, and homophobia and other issues. How did these understandings help you find healing in a way that traditional or U.S. white Buddhism couldn't?
Yes, I think for many of us, I certainly am in this group, we need something more than what has been offered by way of teachers who went to Southeast Asia, to Burma, to Thailand, to India, and studied with masters, forest masters, with monastics who led their own sanghas, very powerful teachers, but the ways in which the teachings were distilled in this particular context is truly very limited. And actually, I have a friend who used to co-teach a class called What Got Left Out, and, really examining that certain teachings were honored in this context, like an emphasis on silent meditation, and other teachings were not, such as the emphasis on Sangha, including families. And so what has been important for me in honoring Baldwin and Lorde, who never once self-identified as Buddhist and certainly never claimed Buddhism as a tradition, was saying, here are writers, thinkers, activists who articulate many of these same teachings, but in a way that we can understand them in this particular context called, at this moment in time, the United States of America. So how do we deal, for example, with causes and conditions when those conditions are a history of enslavement and the auction block, where Black families were separated over centuries? I mean, we're not talking 10 or 20 years, 240 years of chattel slavery, and then more. Think of the Americas and the colonization of islands and Central America, South America, what have you. And to take then the aftermath of chattel slavery seriously, to take Jim Crow, to take Black codes in the South, to take seriously mass incarceration, what we now call the prison industrial complex, to take all of that as part of a set of conditions that arise from a bedrock of racial slavery, is to say these conditions are sources of suffering, and it's important that we name them. It's important that we don't just say suffering arises because we hunger, but suffering also arises because systems come down on us, and systems lock us out, and systems deny our humanity. Narratives are part of those systems. Images are part of those systems. Police forces, violence, all of that. Those are sources of suffering. And I feel like Baldwin and Lorde are important teachers, Buddhist teachers for us, even if they never claimed Buddhism, because they said time and again that these conditions are sources of suffering, and we do suffer because of the human condition, and we suffer because of what comes at us. So to allow for those conditions to be part of the conversation and a part of what we learn, and part of our ethics as Buddhists, to say, actually, we stand against these systems as Buddhist practitioners. We don't stay on the cushion, but we actually speak against these systems. We can broaden that to say internationally, we stand against genocide, we stand against occupation. We are naming this, we are taking it on, we are acknowledging that bombs dropping on families, these are bombs we pay for. These are bombs that our tax dollars support. I don't even know how that's possible, but it is. And so we have to take it on and say, as Buddhists, we name it all because we are fundamentally concerned with suffering and liberation from suffering. And so changing the conditions is part of that practice of liberation.
Mm-hmm. And also I felt like Baldwin's analysis was actually a way also for healing. Like you cite Baldwin, who deconstructs so skillfully whiteness in the U.S., and you cite his article on Being White in Other Lives, where Baldwin breaks down the cost of whiteness and assimilation and the invention of white innocence rooted in the process of this white identity construction, which enables him to better understand white people and perhaps have more compassion for them, I guess. You also quote Baldwin as saying that Black people are taught to despise themselves and that internalized racism is more deadly than guns. And how to heal from internalized racism, Baldwin says, was more important than dismantling material representations of racism. That is so deep, and it's also, I think, important for Baldwin to deal with his own suffering, no?
Yes, for Baldwin, understanding how we internalize the toxic waters we swim in has been, or was for Baldwin, for me, has been a lifelong project. And initially, some of what Baldwin contended with was the harm that his stepfather, the man he called his father, had internalized. And he actually talks about this so evocatively in The Fire Next Time, in the first essay, which is called My Dungeon Shook. And in this, he talks about how his stepfather internalized this idea that he was not as good as white people. And he talks about how Black people are supposed to accept being identified as mediocre, and that we've been trained essentially to accept our lot. We're expected to never push for more, to be excellent. Actually, Audre Lorde talks a lot about this too in her essay on eroticism. To be excellent, to do your work with excellence. But Baldwin is saying actually Black people are expected to contend with mediocrity, and that's not okay. In fact, that's deeply, deeply dehumanizing. So Baldwin looked at his stepfather and said, here's a man who has become bitter, and he refused that for himself. He wanted more for himself. So to go inward, to observe what was around him, but also how he had, in his own way, swallowed what was expected and then resisted that. And he had mentors who guided him forward and said, actually, there's so much more, and could see his love for plays, theater, books. So it wasn't only that he looked around and saw a kind of complacency, for lack of a better word. He did have vision and imagination. He was fostered and supported in many ways. But for Baldwin, that bitterness that he observed first and foremost in his stepfather was something he wrote about quite a lot, especially in his early years and later, and thought actually the way forward is in love, including self-love, is in, you pointed out earlier, this refusal to do what's expected, but also his willingness to suffer, his willingness to go inward and to say there's something valuable here, which is not, a kind of redemptive suffering such as what we find in the Christian tradition, but is a willingness to say, if you can walk through the fire, you might get burned. You might actually not make it, but if you do it, you will attain a kind of unshakable authority that can't be taken away from you. You will grow up. And you're right, he did look at white America's refusal to suffer, to go inward, to deal with the pain, the expectation of death. He did look at that, and he rejected that. He found that there was a kind of shallowness that he really, I think, the word unbearable comes to mind. It was unbearable to stay at that level of superficiality. Baldwin wanted something much deeper for himself. And so he went into his own life and his experience with his family, but he also looked at the blues. He listened to Bessie Smith. He honored the creativity that came out of Black suffering, dispossession, the storms that come. He talked about how Bessie Smith sang of her house falling down, and yet she could create out of that. And he said, that is integrity. That's what I want for myself.
If you're just tuning in, I'm Lisa Detmer, and this is KPFA Radio's Women's Magazine, and we're talking to Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad about her new book, The Fire Inside, The Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde, which is a powerful book which I highly recommend people read. You grew up in a toxic, racist white family, not having your Black father to support you. You had a very personal experience with terror and harm of white racism. But you also come to compassion to those who harmed you. Could you tell our audience how you did that?
The compassion that you name is a compassion towards my father, who did abandon me, who did not ever attempt to find me, and who justified his abandonment and said, there are lots of kids who are abandoned. Why do you feel that you should be any different? And that was deeply wounding, and we never spoke again after that conversation. But to attempt to learn more about his lineage has been really important to me. And I would have been willing to talk with him and to reconcile with him had we reconnected while he was still alive. I think he died from COVID. He was in an institution right when COVID was sweeping through institutions. I did learn that after the fact. My own journey of healing, though, has been much more about how to connect to my ancestors who came from the Deep South. This is my ancestors on my father's side, and also in a more contemporary way to find community where I am valued and I am seen for who I am. And I have found this with Dharma community primarily. People who are similarly structured, who love silence and contemplation, who also think politically, where there's not some kind of divide between the cushion and the street. So that has been really important, and that has been really healing. And then lastly, I'll say I have children. I have an adopted child. I have a biological child. Right now I have a foster child. I have children, and I have a partner, a longtime partner. And I think creating my own family in a way that feels authentic to my being and my values, that has been an important part of my healing process.
I loved your chapter on anger, and as activists, we're taught that anger and rage are helpful for igniting our sense of injustice. But of course, anger is important when it doesn't consume us or make us incapable of seeing the humanity in another person, which is really hard to do. But it seems like some Buddhists have the opposite problem of avoiding suffering. And you talk about it in your book, how some Buddhists fail to take a strong enough position on Palestine and were unable to call out what has been going on in Gaza as genocide. But Buddhism is very much based on compassion and practicing right speech and right action. But it seems like sometimes the emphasis on compassion interferes with right speech and action. I've seen that too. What do you think caused parts of the Buddhist community to fail to speak out about Gaza, and how did you deal with it?
I think this is probably the case, that there are considerations around donors and finances, and that is a huge part of it, and I have zero respect for it. And I say this as someone who is self-funded, who's now an independent scholar. I still have zero respect for that approach. So if that is the reason that some of our bigger, very well-funded Buddhist organizations are not taking a stand, then I do feel they have failed. They have failed with integrity and their ethics. Certainly they have failed those of us who are deeply, deeply impacted by systemic suffering, by systemic harm such as racism, and in the case of Gaza, genocide, in the case of the West Bank, pogroms, occupation. This is egregious. And to stay silent, what it makes me think of is we were in 1850 and the fugitive slave law was passed. These are folks who would stay on their cushions and stay silent, and I cannot respect that in any way, shape, or form. And I have lost friendships around this, and I have, in a certain way, severed some relationships, not because I chose to, but because I will speak, and I am speaking, and it is important to continue speaking. So what can we say in terms of skillfulness? It doesn't mean avoidance. It does mean recognizing somebody else's point of view. But if that view arises from a position of justifying genocide or occupation, then there really is no common language. I think it's one thing to say Jewish people deserve safety. And yes, absolutely. I think it's another thing to say that safety comes at the expense of Palestinians. And no, that is not okay. But that essentially is what has taken place when the nation state of Israel was founded as a Jewish state in 1948, really just 76 years ago now, not a long time ago. People who experienced being driven out from their ancestral homelands are still alive and still living in refugee camps today, right now. So this is not a long time, but it comes on the heels of the Holocaust, of course. And what Baldwin said so succinctly in 1961 is that
in your chapter on anger, you talk about how Audre Lorde completely understood and was compassionate toward Black rage or righteous anger at white oppression and her own anger. And Lorde, like Baldwin, calls for channeling that anger or metabolizing it, as you call, in her writing, and she did that in her poetry. And you point out that Lorde distinguishes between hatred that eats you up and makes you bitter and harms others, and anger that calls out others for accountability, or calls them in, as people say today. And you say you've tried everything to challenge your anger from the abuse of your family and in the world, but it was Buddhism that finally helped you, but not just any Buddhism, but a Buddhism that honors anger and provided a path for metabolizing the poison. And that lineage in Black Buddhists gave you the tools and environment to find a way to transform your bitterness and rage into anger that you could use and control. But you also recognize, as I do, there's a fine line between not reacting and repressing anger. And so I guess this is the dilemma. How do you have anger with tenderness and compassion? I mean, how do you call out someone without, in some way, blaming them?
I do think this is still a growing edge for me personally, because in interpersonal conflict, I will take to my cushion. I will not speak in the moment. Part of what I wrestle with in that first chapter is that I have been someone who has been exiled. So to self-exile, to make someone mad at me by telling them what I think, I will often go down this path and say, if I do this, this will be the consequence. Can I bear the consequence? And I have to really wrestle with that emotionally. It takes a lot of my resources to step out. But I also feel that it is betrayal of myself and of people undergoing such oppression, in this case Palestinians, to stay silent. So to say that in a very direct way, I think, is a path forward. To say, I feel angry, and I also feel that I betray myself if I stay silent, and therefore I do need to speak. And I have said this, and there have been real consequences to that. When I have been asked to speak in some of these Buddhist communities that are staying silent, if they've asked me, for example, to speak about the book, to say, we can't overlook the fact of genocide and occupation. So if you want me to speak about this book, we will also speak about this chapter, and to put that out there. And then, Lisa, these other questions of how to deal with our own anger. It's hard when anger comes at us. And so also wanting to recognize that if we express anger in especially hot ways, like we are in the moment, that it could possibly alienate people beyond repair. I think my own approach to that, and maybe there's too much self-repression. Maybe this is a path of repression. I'm not sure. I would just say this works for me, is to be very in tune, be very intentional, to give that anger a lot of oxygen, but not in close proximity to other people, to not act out of it, to honor it, to let it be fuel, but to not let it be so hot that it burns through a relationship or my own psyche beyond repair. So to give it oxygen, you might say like a controlled burn versus a wildfire, but to acknowledge it and to validate it and to find ways. I mean, sometimes I get really, really worked up, and I will get on an elliptical and just push really hard and sweat really hard. And that's a way to metabolize. I think what we don't want to do is stop speaking. And that is where Audre Lorde calls us out. We don't want to worry about harming other people so that we create harm for ourselves, or we repress and become anxious or depressed. We do have to speak. We do have to be accountable to ourselves. We do have to be accountable to the people who are suffering most. And we can identify those groups of people. But if there is a way to articulate that anger, to name it, but to not let it burn or come across so hot that there's no possibility of repair, I think then we might need to find ways to work through that. I think letting it be known and then letting it be articulated in close proximity and with other people is really important. But lashing out, I think, can do some damage.
I am remembering who I am.
And that's it for today's show. I'm Lisa Detmer, and I've been your host today on Women's Magazines. Tune in next week for another hour of radical feminist voices.
Historian and acclaimed author Robin D.G. Kelley.
David Walker, who was a Black abolitionist, who was a free African-American, published this pamphlet called The Appeal to the Colored Race, where he says, do you understand your own language? Hear your language proclaimed to the world July 4th, 1776. And what he's saying is that you need to be careful. First of all, you don't even believe your language. You don't even believe that all men are created equal because you're certainly not practicing it. But the other part you don't actually understand is that when you say that oppressed people have a right to throw off their government, to resist, to rebel, you've got to understand that's going to happen to you. Don't be fooled into thinking that enslaved people, that Black people will never throw off your murderous government, but rather violent insurrection is inevitable. It's going to come.
Get Learned, only on KPFA.
The Stern Grove Festival returns for the 2026 summer season, and KPFA is once again a media sponsor. The summer concert series kicks off Sunday, June 14th with the Peter Cat Recording Company and ends on Sunday, August 16th with Al Green. For more information, tickets, and to see the full lineup, visit sterngrove.org. This is a wheelchair-accessible event.
KPFA paid staff is associated with the Communications Workers of America, CWA, Local 9415.
This is 94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online everywhere at kpfa.org.
KPFA.